Shake, bake, shake! Playing is not gay! Shake, bake, shake! Stop, students are under attack! Stand up, fight back! There's no backlash, only people's gonna pay! What do we want? USA Day! What do we want now?
Whether it's addressing issues with their education,
the future of the university is under threat,
or an act of solidarity,
Palestine will be free! Palestine will be free!
university students have never shied away from ditching the books and taking to the streets to fight for their causes. Most recently, a quieter protest has been underway at Auckland Uni. This time, it's about the high cost of living.
Rent at the student accommodation at the University of Auckland is just too high. Last year, the university announced an 8% rent hike. So right now, if you're a first-year student, you're paying $510 to $540 every week.
This year's budget includes $136 million in additional funding for universities. But the Minister for Tertiary Education, Penny Simmonds, has also proposed an increase to the rate rise of student fees by more than double. Kia ora, I'm Davina Zimmer, and today on The Detail, who's responsible for footing the bill for universities? And with students already frustrated with high costs, is the recent rent strike a taste of what's to come? Universities are partially funded by the government and use other sources like tuition fees to make up the financial gap. These fees are meant to increase annually to keep pace with inflation, but this hasn't been the case in recent years. Here's Newsroom's reporter Fox Meyer, who's been covering this year's budget announcement.
The thing that was hidden in it that I found to be particularly interesting for students who are going to be paying these off was the hint that they're going to boost the ceiling for the fee increase rate. So what that means is they're considering hiking this all the way from what it is now, which is about 2.8% every year that they can bring it up, all the way to 6%. And they said that they're going to do that so that it can keep pace with inflation, like match up to other sorts of economic measurements. But the funding that the government is putting in themselves to universities does not keep up with inflation. So on one hand, you have an argument that university funding should match inflation, but only when the students are paying it. And when the government's paying it, we don't have to use that same metric. The universities are set to receive, I think, approximately $136 million from the government over the next 4 years. Otago University alone faced a $60 million deficit, right? So 136 over 4 years isn't even enough to bail out one of these institutions now. And so I think the justification here was that they were saying, well, we're going to be providing money to these universities, but really what we're going to be doing is opening up a pathway for them to further become, quote unquote, self-sufficient, that same model of like user pays sort of design for funding. And if you're in the university sector, this is not necessarily bad news. If you are now able to charge a 6% higher rate on essentially the product that you're offering, that's great. That's a lot more money that's going to be able to fill in the gaps of an institution that does need gaps filled. It's just, in my opinion, a bit of a shame that the money that's going to be filling these gaps is coming from individual, very young people and their families' pockets rather than a government institution.
Well, it's interesting as well, isn't it? Because then it's going to raise the question of if we see a 6% increase in fees, there could be, a significant portion of the population, especially during a cost of living crisis, who kind of just say, nah, not going to go to uni.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's the difference between the right to something and the ability to exercise that right. We might have the right to go to university and get education, but I might not be able to afford it. So what good is that right at the end of the day then? In terms of people deciding whether or not to go, on one hand, it's excellent that everybody can and should go to university. But on the other hand, there are other options out there if you want to have a successful career and be financially stable. And I feel like the product that universities are offering these days has less to do with the actual degree and the education and more to do with the university experience. I think that's what they're really trying to sell here. And that's something that they can sell. And so when people make that decision not to go to university, yes, they are deciding, I'm not going to receive that classic education, whatever that may be. And you can find a different education elsewhere. But what you can't replace is going to be that, that sense of becoming an adult and that this proving ground for maturity that you go into, that we all as a society agree is just the way things work. And I think that's going to be a much more nuanced discussion.
You kind of had to go digging for this announcement about the fee increase for tertiary education. Why was it hidden?
I don't know if it was intentionally hidden. I'd never say that things were, deliberately obfuscated like that. It's tricky. I'd like to give it the benefit of the doubt, but you go into budget day in the lockup and they give you this, all the press releases and announcements. And it was in that press release, but it wasn't the headline, right? Obviously, you're not going to say our headlining item is students are going to end up paying more. That doesn't sound good. But yeah, it was just sort of towards the end of this press release document. There were a lot of other numbers in there. And this one stuck out to me because, writing for Critic for the last 2 years, every time that fee increase goes up, we report on it because people want to know on it. People want to know what it is. And over the last 4 years, it went from something like 1.1 something, 2.8, I think, and then 2.85. These are percent increases in those fees every year. And every year, those were the maximum amounts. The university is going to pick that maximum amount every year. Why wouldn't it? And so when I saw 6% on there as a potential number, that was a bit worrying to me. If I were paying for university right now, I would not want the tuition fees going up 6%. That's a meteoric rise.
Fox says it's not just the hike in fees that will anger students.
Yeah, I think the feeling on the ground is it's outrageous. I think, no student, if you went to them and you said, hey, are you happy that you're shelling out however many thousands of dollars to get this education? Nobody's going to say, yeah, I'm stoked about that. They're all going to wish they had that money in their pocket instead. Nobody wants to be paying for it. But as long as we are paying for it, I think people would like it to feel like a fair deal. And I don't think it feels like a fair deal at the moment. I think students feel like they're getting fleeced. We expect every year, the students that are paying attention at least, for those numbers to go up because everything goes up every year. It's just a matter of how much it goes up. And historically, we've seen it accelerating, bit by bit, but still never above that 2.85% amount. And to see it jump from that to 6% is a bit of a slap in the face, especially from a budget and a government that's saying they're trying to reward hard work, that education's so important. And, if that's the case, why don't you pay for it? The people designing these rules and laws did not have to pay for it. So if this is so important, why is this double standard being enacted? Why are we having to pay for the shortfalls in education?
The latest strike action was, the students' issue was very much with the university. Do you think that frustration is perhaps a bit misdirected and it should be more towards government instead of universities?
Yes and no. I think no matter what, if students are striking and upset about something, I'm just happy to see collective action being taken. That being said, I think there is a bit of nuance here. I think that the universities themselves are in a position where they have been directed to operate in a way that is not easy and requires them to go find a lot of money. And they're going to do that however they possibly can. And that means increasing the rates for all sorts of services that they offer their students, including housing. But if you're a student and you're presented with that, you're going to be mad about it. And you should be, because what I would like to see, and maybe what they would like to see as well, is, okay, well, if the universities are in this situation, at least don't let them be happy about it. If you're going to be increasing these fees on us, we better see you pushing as hard as you possibly can towards the government for a way to alleviate that funding shortfall. Just don't be out there and be passé about hiking us by 6%. You better not be happy when you do that. And I think the middle ground that can be found here is communication between students and universities, and realizing that, actually, we both are frustrated with this funding model. Currently, it's the students that are footing the majority of the bill, but let's not let them feel alone in that.
This particular proposal is yet to be met with student protest, but if past events are anything to go by, it's only a matter of time. In 2021, Victoria University students protested against a $150 placeholder fee for the halls that the university tried to enforce, despite not being allowed back under Alert Level 3.
Victoria University students asked to leave their university halls for lockdown will soon have to foot some of the bill, even though they can't yet return. They've been told that this coming week they will have to pay up to $150.
Accommodation fees had been waived for Level 4, but an email sent out to students across 9 university-run halls last night told them that from Wednesday, students temporarily absent from catered accommodation must pay $150 a week until they can return.
And last year, University of Otago tutors joined students to protest against a proposed staffing cut.
Stand up, fight back! Community jobs are under attack!
Staff and students marching together,
No ifs, no buts. Keep the jobs and stop the cuts.
demanding the university rule out job losses.
2, 4, 6, 9, nothing such should be a crime!
The latest student action was again on the topic of accommodation costs, with 16 students living in the University of Auckland halls not paying rent for all of last month.
What we're saying is the university actually has a responsibility outside of that residential agreement to provide safe, secure and affordable accommodation for students, and they're not doing that. They also have a responsibility to engage with students, and they've explicitly refused to do that, actually. Some people are even saying they have to pay rent instead of pay for food for the week. These are stories, real stories that the university is ignoring.
So sort of like out in the real world when
real.
people struggle financially as well.
Yeah, well, the difference is, though, that university students are full-time students, not full-time workers.
That's Matthew Lee, a spokesperson for the Students for Fair Rent campaign. I spoke to him at the beginning of the strike action, which he says was the only way to try to trigger change.
I think the problem is multifaceted. I've always been very clear that the problem doesn't lie just with the university. I fully acknowledge that there are high costs to running student accommodation. In New Zealand, student accommodation is fully unsubsidised by the government, and it is also fully unregulated under the Residential Tenancies Act. So in Section 5B of the RTA excludes student accommodation completely from the provisions of the clause. So student renters like myself, no rights as a renter at all. Those two are massive problems, and we've tried to engage the government. We've tried to get them to intervene and, sit in the conversation with us. So far, they've been unwilling to respond.
The university did respond to you. They said the reason why they couldn't use the rate of inflation as a guide of setting student rent was because there were other costs associated with the halls that had increases that were higher than the rate of inflation. So we're talking wages of employees and food costs. Doesn't that sound like a reasonable reason as to why they can't match it with inflation?
Yeah, I think the very first thing we need to make very clear is we are a bunch of students, right? We are not decision makers. We are not experts in finance or business management. Our responsibility right now is to bring this issue to the university. We are telling the university that students are literally struggling to live. Research by the university itself showed that 32% of students fortnightly have to pay rent instead of food. So they're choosing to pay rent instead of buying a meal for
And
that
are these students who are living in the halls or students as a whole?
Students as a whole.
Okay.
But also looking at the cost of rent at student accommodation, it is significantly higher than the average rent in Auckland Central.
What makes you think that rent is that much higher?
So a self-catered accommodation at the university, it's a regular flat with three to five bedrooms. If we look at the average rate in Auckland Central for a similar kind of flat, it's $200. I'm paying $350. That is a $150 increase. Now, granted, I do get more services living in student accommodation. It is not a $150 increase worth in that rent.
What do you think is a fair amount to be paying for student accommodation?
I think, first of all, it should be a lot closer to the average rate of rent in Auckland Central. So, like we said before, that $200 figure. Obviously, I recognise that we should be paying a premium because of the extra services that we get. And like you said, the comfort of living close to campus as well. I recognise that that is very attractive to a lot of students. And that's why I love living at halls as well. I think one thing that a lot of people have a misconception of is that I hate living at halls or I hate student accommodation. No, I love student accommodation. I'm a third-year student, and this is my third year living at halls. I love it. It's just unfair that the university expects us to pay that much.
Okay. What would your response be to those who think that this strike is just a group of students who are ignorant to the reality of what it costs to live these days? Because cost of living is high.
Yeah, cost of living is high. Cost of living is high for students as well. I think most disproportionately affects students as well. The reason is because students are full-time students. We should be studying full-time. And education, like I said before, is a right. And it should not be a privilege. Rent should never be the barrier to that right. And I think, looking at the benefits of having accessible education as well, it leads to a more educated workforce, leads to a more productive economy. Those are all benefits that we can all share if I'm able to go to a lecture and not go to work to pay my rent.
The students have ended their rent strike, and now they say they're looking into the Residential Tenancies Act. This has been a focus for Green Party co-leader Chloe Swarbrick and was also an element in the 2021 inquiry into student accommodation, which was launched after COVID-19 exposed vast inequalities across New Zealand universities. The announcement that the strike was over was news for Brendan Mosley, who's the Director of Campus Life at the university.
I'm still catching up on this morning, but so the first we knew about it was that a group of students had set themselves up as Students for Fair Rent and made some social media posts about how the university was exploiting its students and charging unfair rents. And sometime after that, they contacted us to ask questions. So we responded to their questions. They submitted a petition, actually. They went around and got a bunch of signatures on a petition saying that the university was charging too much. And we responded in quite some detail to that petition. And we subsequently met with them, with Chloe Swarbrick from the Green Party.
Student accommodation should not be run as a business. It should be a not-for-profit model which ultimately is operating for the benefit of student well-being so that students can, guess what, get a good education. Because unfortunately what we're seeing right now is that far too many students are having to take on 20, 30, sometimes 40 hours per week working on top of full-time study in order to pay for their student accommodation, which of course comes at the detriment of their ability to do that education in the first place.
Does the halls generate a profit?
No.
I did read a report that did say there is a slight profit generated, but it goes towards the maintenance of the halls. Could you tell me a little bit more about that aspect?
Yeah, so we aim for a small surplus.
Okay.
And that gives us a little bit of a wiggle room. But, just on last year's numbers, for example, we took in revenue of $67.5 million and expenses were 69.4. So we lost 1.8 million. We're still in a COVID recovery. The borders are open and everything looks like it's gone back to normal, but we're still rebuilding our international student market, for example. So that's improving year on year. This year we should be in the black for the first time since 2019. If we make a small surplus, and I think we were budgeted to make a couple of $100,000 this year, that goes into building projects and new developments.
These students who are part of the strike action group, their request was decrease the fees, right?
Yes, but they haven't actually said by how much. So we met and explained all the things that we'd explained in our written response to them. We've said, how much do you think the fees should be? And who do you think should cover that cost? Because, as we've explained, we can't use any of our other funding sources to subsidise accommodation, so who's going to pay that cost? And they haven't responded to that, and in fact they've said that they're not going to, that it's not their job to respond. There's been very little interaction with them. We did write to those who were striking and said, look, we understand you're making a point here, you're protesting, but nevertheless, financial hardship issues could be a factor for you as well. So if that's the case, come talk to us. They haven't been willing to do that. So,
okay. What are the consequences of a student not paying their rent? I mean, I've heard reports of students claiming their keycards access was cancelled.
No, we haven't kicked anyone out or locked anyone out. Ultimately, though, if you don't pay your rent, guess what happens? We've got students lining up to live in our accommodation. We can't preclude some of our students from benefiting from accommodation on campus whilst allowing others to stay there rent-free.
When it comes to setting the price, Brendan says they're doing their best to keep costs low.
There are some benefits to scale, so we can negotiate good deals with the power companies, with our food providers. Food last year was about $10 million across all our properties, so it's a significant cost, and it went up by 10 or 12% last year, so much higher than the CPI. The buildings we lease typically have CPI increases every 2 or 3 years, And so, we've been ticking along at 2-3% increases. What's happened as we've emerged from COVID, as you know, is there's a cost of living crisis for everyone, and inflation has been very high. And so that means suddenly we're hit with quite large increases on our rental properties. But they're only about half of our portfolio. We are in negotiations with one of our landlords at the moment to try and get a rent reduction.
So how far in advance do students know the cost?
Typically in August of the previous year. When we open for applications, we usually have the fee set. And if we don't, then absolutely by the time they sign their contract, we make offers starting in about October of the previous year. So what they sign up to is what they get.
And do students have an understanding of where that money's going? Do you provide like a kind of breakdown of those costs?
No, not automatically. Most students aren't particularly interested in the details. We can provide a lot of that information if we need to, and I'm happy to do so, happy to talk through where the money goes. It's all accounted for. It's not a secret. Some of the figures are commercially sensitive, the lease costs for private providers. But no, it's no secret, and it's all reported in our accounts. No, I think it's pretty tough for students, and my personal view is that as a country we need to invest a heck of a lot more in tertiary education. Right now, there are questions over how much that should be, but overall, I think tertiary education is a fantastic investment for any country to make, and we should be making a much bigger investment in it. Some students are fine, many students aren't, and many other people should be students and they're not because they just can't afford to come to university, and I think that's a real shame. But ultimately, that's it's a question for the taxpayer, and it's a question for the government to decide how much to allocate. But do I think students have got it easy? No.
Let's get back to Newsroom's Fox Meyer. He says when it comes to protesting university policies, students have an extra hurdle thanks to a 2011 law change.
Students clinging to the hope that national MPs would have a change of heart before today's final vote on the voluntary student membership bill have been protesting outside Parliament. The third and final reading of the bill is being debated in the House, and if it's passed, it would become law before the election.
Essentially what that meant is you opted into something like OUSA, the Otago University Students Association. And I think that if that wasn't in place, these student unions would have a lot more autonomy and authority to act on behalf of these students and really push those universities to, apply for funding from the government or whatever it may be, find that other solution. And I think having that larger body that exists permanently in a very transient space is critical for organizing any sort of collective action. Otherwise, you just have a population of people that recycles every 3 or 4 years. It's really hard to get your footing that way. But if you have a solid student union there that can act on your behalf, you're a lot more likely to see things go through. And I think without the effects of voluntary student membership, the current protest sphere might look very different.
That's it for today. Thanks to Fox Meyer, Matthew Lee and Brendan Mosley. The Detail is funded by RNZ and NZ On Air. This episode was produced by Alexia Russell and Gwen McClure and engineered by Jeremy Ansell. I'm Davina Zimmer, Mā te wā.